AITA for moving out and leaving my family behind. So I now 26M, am the youngest of 3 kids. My older brothers, let's call them Jake, 28M, and Logan, 30M, were always the golden boys of the family. My parents practically worshipped them. From the time we were little, it was made very clear that Jake and Logan were destined to become these high-powered, future businessmen, or whatever fantasy my parents built up for them. They got everything that fit that image. Tutors, new laptops as soon as their old ones got even slightly outdated, fresh clothes every school year, workshops, extracurriculars, the whole package. They were constantly being invested in, as my parents liked to say, while I just kind of existed in the background. When they got an A, my parents treated it like a national achievement. They'd take pictures, brag to family friends, even go out for dinner sometimes. Meanwhile, when I brought home an A, my mom would look at the report card and say something like, "See, you can do better when you actually try," as if any success I had was accidentally stumbled into rather than earned. That dynamic never really changed as we grew up. There was always this sense that their accomplishments were proof of greatness, while mine were reminders that I needed to work harder or was finally catching up. It was subtle at times and painfully obvious at others, and after a while, it became normal, just the way things were. By the time I hit middle school, Jake and Logan were already being groomed for business school like it was some family legacy. They joined DECA, took every finance or entrepreneurship elective our school offered, and were constantly seen carrying around investing books that our parents bought them. My mom would beam about how focused they were, and my dad would go on and on about how they were ahead of the curve, even when all they did was skim a chapter or show up to a meeting. They basically got praised for just existing in that space. Meanwhile, I was pretty much invisible unless I messed up somehow. If I got a bad grade, forgot something, or annoyed them in any way, suddenly I had their full attention, but never in a good way. And the worst part was that whenever I actually wanted to share something I was excited about, whether it was something I drew, a joke I heard, or just a random story about my day, I always got hit with the same dismissive responses. "Not now. We're busy. Later. Go away." After hearing that enough times, it stopped feeling like bad timing and started feeling like I just wasn't worth listening to. So I eventually just learned to keep things to myself. It became easier to stay quiet than to risk bothering anyone. When I was 13, I became deeply invested in coding. It wasn't something anyone around me was interested in, and I didn't have friends or mentors I could talk to about it, so I ended up learning entirely on my own. I spent hours watching YouTube tutorials, reading forum posts, and experimenting through trial and error, slowly teaching myself how things worked. It was challenging and confusing at times, but I kept going because I genuinely enjoyed it. Eventually, I decided to apply what I had learned and built a small website focused on a very niche gaming topic. In the beginning, it was purely a personal project, something I worked on out of curiosity and interest rather than with any serious expectations. Over time, though, I kept refining it, fixing mistakes, improving the design, and adding new features whenever I learned how to implement them. Each small improvement made me more motivated to continue. At some point, the site started gaining traction. People were actually visiting it, interacting with it, and coming back. What began as a simple hobby turned into something real, with consistent traffic and thousands of visitors each month. Seeing strangers use something I had built from scratch was incredibly exciting, and I felt genuinely proud of myself for the first time in a long while. When I finally told my parents about it, I expected at least a little recognition or interest. Instead, they brushed it off almost immediately. "That's nice, dear. Did you do your homework?" Meanwhile, Jake and Logan were praised for writing their first mock business plan for DECA. I had built an actual, functioning product that real people were using, something tangible and proven, yet it didn't seem to matter. Because it wasn't part of a program, a class, or something officially recognized, it apparently didn't count at all. When I turned 15, I decided to take the site more seriously. I began experimenting with ways to monetize it, starting with a few premium features and some basic ads. At first, it felt strange to think of something I had built as a source of income, but it quickly became clear that people were willing to pay for the value it offered. Not long after that, sponsorship opportunities started coming in, followed by affiliate programs that brought in even more revenue. Before I fully processed what was happening, I was making real money, far more than any 15-year-old should reasonably expect to have. It didn't feel flashy or dramatic, it was just surreal. Something that had started as a quiet, solitary hobby had turned into a consistent source of income that kept growing month after month. While my brothers were asking for allowance, I kept everything low-key. With my uncle's help, I opened a bank account and began managing the money myself. I didn't spend recklessly or show it off. Instead, I started investing, trying to be careful and intentional about what I did with it. The website continued to grow alongside my experience, eventually expanding into what was effectively a small business rather than just a personal project. As for my parents, nothing changed. They still showed little to no interest in what I was doing, remaining focused instead on Jake and Logan and what they saw as their corporate futures. Even as the site grew into something legitimate and sustainable, it felt invisible in their eyes. When my brothers reached their senior year, everything shifted in a different direction. They started partying heavily, going out constantly, and treating school like an afterthought. My parents didn't seem bothered by it at all. In fact, they actively encouraged it. They need to network. Businessmen have to know how to socialize. That was the justification they used every time something went wrong. In reality, it was mostly chaos. Half the time, Jake and Logan came home drunk, loud and careless, breaking things around the house or causing unnecessary problems. Any normal consequences were brushed aside with excuses like boys will be boys, as if that somehow explained or excused the behavior. My parents chose not to see the damage, physical or otherwise, because it didn't fit the image they had of their future success. Meanwhile, my life looked completely different. I stayed focused on expanding my business, dealing with clients, managing income, paying taxes, and learning practical, real-world skills that most people my age never had to think about. I was quietly building something stable and sustainable, even if no one at home seemed to notice or care. Around that time, I met Sarah, who was sitting next to me in computer science class. She was the first person I encountered who was genuinely curious about what I was doing. She asked questions, listened, and didn't dismiss it as just a hobby or phase. We started talking more, then hanging out after school, and eventually we began dating. She became the first person in my life to tell me, sincerely, that I was actually good at something. That validation, simple as it was, meant more to me than anything else I had accomplished up to that point. Jake and Logan ended up getting into a mediocre business college, which my parents still treated like a major victory. Once they were there, the partying only escalated. Classes became secondary, then irrelevant, and before long it all fell apart. First Jake dropped out, and then Logan followed not long after. By the end of it, neither of them had a degree, a job, or any real sense of direction or motivation. Eventually, they both moved back home, one at 21 and the other at 23, carrying nothing with them except excuses. My parents were crushed. They framed it as a shock, something they never saw coming, and convinced themselves it was just a temporary setback. Instead of pushing them to take responsibility, they doubled down on support, continuing to make excuses and smooth things over. Time passed, then more time, and nothing changed. Years went by with both of my brothers still living at home, financially dependent, unemployed, and without any concrete plans for the future. While all of that was happening, my life followed a completely different trajectory. I finished high school and kept scaling my business at the same time, refining systems, expanding operations, and taking on more responsibility. I started hiring freelancers to handle different parts of the work, learning how to manage people as well as projects. By the time I was 19, the income had grown into something substantial. The kind of money that clearly separated a hobby from a real, successful business. And yet, no one in my family knew. I kept it entirely to myself, operating quietly in the background, separate from the chaos, the disappointment, and the expectations that had consumed everyone else. Then one night, my parents called for what they described as a family meeting over dinner. I still remember that evening with absolute clarity, every detail burned into my memory. The mood felt tense and serious before anyone even spoke. My dad cleared his throat, folded his hands on the table, and said, We need to have a talk. You're all adults now. You need to get a job or you can't keep living here for free. Jake and Logan reacted instantly, complaining and talking over each other. How are we supposed to get jobs right now? There's nothing out there. They sounded frustrated, defensive, and entitled all at once. Then, almost in unison, they turned their attention to me. And you, one of them added, you need to start contributing instead of hiding in your room all day. That was the moment I finally spoke up. For years, I had stayed quiet, letting assumptions be made about me, letting myself be overlooked because it felt easier than fighting to be heard. But something about that moment made it clear that staying silent wasn't an option anymore. I explained everything. I told them about the website I had built when I was 13, about how it slowly turned into a real business by the time I was 15. I explained the premium features, the ads, the sponsorships, the affiliate programs, and how the income grew over time. I talked about the taxes I had paid, the bank accounts I managed, and the investments I had been making for years. Then I showed them the proof: documentation, invoices, growth charts, and records that left no room for doubt. My dad's jaw literally dropped as he flipped through the papers. My mom didn't say anything at all. She just stared at me, like she was looking at a stranger, or maybe like she was realizing for the first time that she never really knew me. When I finished, I took a breath and told them the final piece. I'm not staying, I already bought a house. I've been packing all week. The room went completely still. My siblings froze, unable to process what they had just heard. Jake finally broke the silence, mumbling in disbelief. You bought a house. My mom tried to sound offended, her voice tight with emotion. Why didn't you tell us any of this? I didn't raise my voice or argue. I just looked at her and said, simply and honestly, you never listened. I moved out that weekend, just like I said I would. There was no dramatic goodbye and no last-minute change of heart. It felt calm, deliberate, and long overdue. A month later, Sarah moved in with me, and for the first time, my life felt genuinely stable and intentional. We built our routine together, supported each other, and slowly turned the house into a real home rather than just a place to live. The years that followed moved quickly but meaningfully. By 23, we were married, choosing each other with complete certainty. By 25, we had 2 kids, and our lives became fuller in ways that had nothing to do with money or success. Through it all, the business continued to grow steadily. What once had been a one-person operation evolved into something much larger, and eventually I hired a full-time team to help run it. It became sustainable, structured, and no longer depended solely on me. We're happy, not in a performative or forced way, but in the quiet, grounded sense of happiness that comes from building something real over time. The kind that doesn't need validation. As for Jake and Logan, as far as I know, they're still living with my parents. They cycle through business ideas every so often, talking about plans that never seem to turn into action. Nothing ever really changes. The momentum they always promised themselves never materializes. My parents try to reach out more now. They check in, ask questions, and attempt to sound supportive, but it always feels heavy, like regret disguised as concern. There's an unspoken awareness behind every conversation, an understanding that they miss something important and can't undo it. Recently, they told me, "We wish we had paid more attention to you." I didn't argue or explain, I just nodded. There was nothing left to say and nothing left to prove. I don't hate them, I never did, but I don't owe them any more either.